any case, I was part of the Winkler Orchestra, and we went to Brandon for something, for a weekend, and, with musicians from all over Manitoba. And Deirdre Irons was playing something, and there was this woman in the audience, and we kids were up on sort of bleachers, so we were looking down upon the grown-ups. There was this woman in the audience who was talking during Deirdre's performance. I was so outraged. I mean, I was only about 12 or 13, but I couldn't believe this woman would talk out loud while somebody's playing the piano. And I thought, why doesn't somebody tell her to be quiet? And then at the end of the performance, the pianist got a bow, and she put out her hand to acknowledge the composer, and this little noisy lady who had been talking stood up and took a bow, and I realized, oh, well, she's the composer. She had reason.
Do you remember what she was saying?
Oh, no, I couldn't hear what she was saying.
Oh.
I just knew she was being terribly rude to talk right through somebody else's performance. Why didn't somebody tell her? So that was my first introduction to Eckhardt-Gramatté. And of course, she looked very different from everybody else in those days with her manly appearance, the suits to negate the fact that she was a woman composer, I think is what it was, and a very short, practical haircut. But always the big smile. She had a very big smile. Then I don't remember too many specific instances until later in Winnipeg. She was after my parents to have me study with her, and she and my parents were very good friends. She would come up to my father, his name was Jake, and she'd say, "Jake, your daughter should be studying with me." And he'd say, "Sonia, I'll never allow it." And then they'd laugh, and they'd hug, and they'd kiss on both cheeks, and then they'd talk about something else. And so, but this was, I think, said more than once. I think that happened more than once, and my father was not going to allow me to study with her. But then she would come up to me in various locations and various times and try to make the point. And one time was at the old auditorium where the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra used to play. And in those days, they had receptions after the concerts, which was quite wonderful because we younger students, we younger players, teenagers, could visit with the orchestral players over punch and cookies or something like that. It was really a very nice arrangement. So here there was quite a big circle of us down in this room, and including some of my friends from high school, I think, who weren't really musicians, but I wanted to introduce them to some of the musicians in the orchestra who were friends of mine. And along comes this short little lady, of course, Eckhardt-Gramatté. And she didn't say hello to me. She just walked up to me and she says, "I bet you practice scales 5 hours a day. Na 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 na. If you were with me, the technique would be in the bucket." And she stomped off. She did not say hello. She did not say goodbye. And my friends just looked at me as if to say, "Who was that?" So that's a very strong memory in my mind. And then she was actually what we would consider unethical in my own teacher's home. My teacher was Alma Brock-Smith later during my university years. A very fine teacher. And she, although she was very elegant and very much a gracious lady, I think she understood Sonia's genius and really accepted her in a way perhaps others didn't. And so they were good friends. And one time I was playing in my teacher's home, Alma Brock-Smith's home, and Eckhardt-Gramatté was there, and in my teacher's home came up to me and said, "You should be studying with me." I mean, that's really quite outrageous and may help to explain, if that was sort of her mode of behavior, it might help to explain why Winnipeg was so aghast at who she was, because Winnipeggers were very polite. And I'm being reminded of that now at the National Convention of Registered Music Teachers now in 1999. People are very gracious and state things very beautifully and express their thanks, but it's all within sort of a sense of discretion and so on. And she didn't grow up that way. She wasn't taught that. And so it would have been difficult for her to understand them, and extremely difficult for them to get beyond their shock at her different kind of manners and her different kind of personality. So those are some of my strongest memories. Then one time, my parents had wanted to invite the Eckhardts over for an evening. They'd been in this home, 54 Harrow, several times, and they thought, well, it would be very nice to have the Eckhardts to our house. So my mother spoke with Eckhardt-Gramatté at a symphony concert, I think in September of one year. And she said, we would very much like to have you and Ferdinand over to our home sometime. And Sonia says, oh, let me see. And she pulls out her appointment book. She says, now this is September, mind you. She says, April 4th would suit us. Well, that was very foreign to my mother's way of thinking. Very foreign. I mean, that had no meaning, you know. So she promptly forgot about it. This also says some things about my mother, but the story is about Eckhardt-Gramatté. So anyhow, my mother gave no thought to it. That was a long ways off, and it didn't occur to her that this would get set down in an appointment book. Well, on April 3rd, she got a call saying, it still suits us to come tomorrow. And I believe tomorrow, I think April 3rd was a Good Friday, and tomorrow was April 4th, Saturday, between Good Friday and Easter Sunday, something like that. It had to do with Good Friday, and it had to do with the fact that the stores were all closed at that time on such a weekend. And so here they're coming, and my mother didn't know what to do because she couldn't go to the store to go shopping. So there was this dither in our household. But my mother was always very resourceful as a hostess, and they managed very nicely. But the other amusing thing is that my father went into this state of energy, which he could do easily, and thought, oh, this is the director of the Winnipeg Art Gallery coming to our house. What shall I do? So he took this family Bible with these wretched reproductions of art, and he carefully opened this Bible to some reproduction and laid it out on the coffee table. And I didn't think that was a great idea, but I didn't say anything. And so the Eckharts came, and we had invited some other people as well. Well, I'll tell you, they never looked at that artwork on the coffee table. It never came up. Nobody glanced at it. They were so entertaining. It was such a wonderful evening because they were such great storytellers, and they could have such fun telling stories about Vienna and about her composing techniques and just having fun, sometimes poking fun at each other or whatever. It was just the most marvelous evening. And whatever the food was turned out to be fine, and they hardly paid attention anyhow, you know. So we were glad that it still suited them to come. I should also say that where she'd been very serious and rather aggressive about having me study with her, when I turned around and decided to play one of her pieces and asked her which piece I should play because I'd really like to play one of her works, her attitude changed completely, and it was almost a shift in personality. Suddenly, she was very gentle and so sweet and so touched that I would want to play a piece of hers. And she said, you will play my 5th sonata because that is my best sonata, and I will give you my score. I have made corrections, and she autographed it to me and gave me a copy of this, which of course I have to this day. I've used it a lot, so it's getting tattered and torn. And then I had 2 sessions with her. I asked if I could play it for her once I'd learned it. It took me a while, but once I'd learned it. And she was most gracious in working with me. And I have very vivid memories of her marching around the living room. She must have been in her 70s already. But as quick as a 5-year-old, physically, and as quick as a 5-year-old with her emotions, just to show these quick changes of temperament within the piece. And then I did perform it quite a bit in the U.S., and I think maybe once in Canada at that time. Since then I've played it many times. But I played it in a number of places in the U.S., and again she was so grateful that she took one of her prints, original prints of Walter Gramatté's, the composer. I'm sure you know that well. It's very famous. And she signed that herself and had it framed for me as a present to me. So there was just this complete shift in attitude, one of real gratefulness. It was very, very touching. Let's stop there for a moment.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, no. 2 other just cute things, but...
Well, I wanted to ask you, like you've been performing these pieces, like the alphabet pieces and all the childhood pieces, and you said you played the 5th sonata.
Oh, quite a bit.
Quite a bit since. I was wondering what your experience with the reception of this music has been, and I suppose throughout the 80s and 90s now, what the reputation that you've encountered in different places, I suppose, might have ended up being for Sonia and for her music.
Yeah, well, with the Fifth Sonata, I've played that many, many times, but I always try to introduce it, and it seems to me that makes an enormous difference, not just with her music, but with anybody's music, to talk a little bit about the composer and about the music, some sense of how it's put together, just a 5-minute talk. And that really seems to help people connect with it more readily before I even start playing. And so even with people who aren't necessarily musically knowledgeable and you think would really react negatively, I've often had a very warm reception to it. And they say, oh, I found that really interesting. And my take on her music, the works I've played the most of the later works are the First Sonata, the Danse de Negre, and the Fifth Sonata, all of which I've recorded with the help of the Foundation. My experience with that music is, and my take on it, is that it's very impulsive, even in the Fifth Sonata, which is more highly structured. And her impulsive, temperamental personality, and as I said just a moment ago, this ability to change on a dime as if she were 5 years old, to go from crying to laughing to being serious, that comes through so strongly in her music. And if I point that out to people before they start hearing it, I think they're captivated by that. They're very interested in that. I also find it very interesting that a lot of students, university students, high school students, like to have this music on while they're studying. Now that boggles my mind, wouldn't help me in my studying. And I've had massage therapists tell me that they use this with their patients. And I think, I wouldn't be able to relax with that music, but if somebody else really enjoys it, fine. So, I've had diverse experiences with responses along those lines. The pieces from my childhood, of course, are different, and the response is quite different there. I've done this in workshops quite a number of times for piano teachers, and they often respond very positively to the music. They love the music. Sometimes they're not so sure that they would use it in teaching because it's far more difficult than you might think, than you would think when you first looked at it. So there's perhaps a reservation. But in terms of the music itself, they really seem to respond to it, as do students. And the Nocturne in particular, I've had a number of students say, oh, Dr. Edwards, that piece you played, or that piece so-and-so played, I just have got to learn that. Do you have the music for that? And so I have students begging me to learn the Nocturne. Or to learn something of hers. They're just very intrigued by her story. Yeah, I'd like to learn something. What do you think? So, did that answer all of your questions?
I think so. Yeah, actually, it's interesting because there were 2 people, I believe, who came up after your presentation and asked specifically for the Valse Chromatique.
Oh,
because that went over really well. Well, you played the whole thing,
yes.
So there were a couple people who came up and said, I like that one. Which book is that one in?
Yes.
And so that was certainly. Is there anything else that you can think of that you wanted to put on?
Well, I will say about
little
this,
stories or anything that maybe secondhand or something.
Well, first of all, about the pieces. Some of those are really strong concert pieces. I mean, they aren't just little children's pieces, hardly. They really stand on their own in a concert program, and in an artist kind of program, a group of them can be a very nice addition. Yes, I did want to say about. Well, I will say that there are some people who simply don't like her later things, the more dissonant things, but it wouldn't just be her music. They probably don't like dissonant music anyhow. So I don't know that they're distinguishing between her music and somebody else's. Except I will say, and here I'm treading on some dangerous ground, but I have also played her version of Paganini's La Campanella many times. And it's very, very difficult, as you well know. She took some of Liszt's version, and she took some of Busoni's version, and then she interpolated some things to make it more difficult. I've seen the score in this very house, so I know exactly what she did. And she begins by putting the theme in the major, which is always very surprising to people who know the Liszt piece, the Busoni piece, or the original violin piece. And I do remember dear Leonard Isaacs saying he did not like her version of this piece at all. and I hope it's all right to say that, but he would say, why did she have to go tromping over a piece that was perfectly beautiful before she put her hands on it? And he might have been expressing the opinion of several people just of that generation.
There's one thing I do want to, you might be interested in. When I first took up music, when I was first doing violin music, most of it was solo music that was written in the 1920s, and I played some recordings from our faculty advisor, and he's the opposite persuasion. He didn't like the way that it wasn't very structured, first of all, and found that he found that it was cliched at times. But it was interesting because he had never really heard any of her music, and I was the one who introduced her music to him, and this was really good. But then, several months later, after we'd actually written the final thesis, he had the opportunity to hear, I think it was the Triple Concerto on a CD, or something like this, and maybe a couple of the other later, more dissonant works, and he came up to me and said, she wrote a lot of good music. It's just you chose the stuff that isn't very good.
See.
So it was exactly the opposite. He likes the later stuff that's more dissonant and perhaps a little bit more structured in some ways.
Yeah, well, the compositional craft is definitely stronger in the later pieces. Yeah. Well, sure, and he's an educated musician.
Yeah, well, he's a Baird scholar.
Oh, well, there
so
too. Right.
He has a bit of a prejudice for
Sure.
it.
Right. Yes. Well, we can come back to the music. Well, I will say, my observation, too, for instance, with the first sonata, certainly more than the fifth. I don't see this at all in the fifth. But in the first sonata, it's as though she's having to prove herself by saying, look, Schumann wrote in this style, I can write a phrase in Schumann style. Chopin wrote like this, I can write a passage that comes right out of Chopin. It's so interesting how you hear, for a moment, you hear, it's almost like a jazz player. Suddenly you hear a little bit of Mozart in this jazz player's improv, And even in the beginning of the first piano sonata, one of my friends says, oh, that sounds just like the Balakirev first piano sonata. Or maybe not the first piano sonata, but a piano sonata that Balakirev wrote. And of course it also sounds like Bach. So I can see that she was just trying to prove to people, I can write it as well as any of these famous men, and maybe better. Oh, she would have thought she had written better. Oh yes, I will say, that reminds me of another story my father used to tell. And at one time he made a major mistake. He sat with Sonia at a symphony concert. Never again. Because they must have been in a side loge, and he said it was awful. During this first piece the symphony was playing, she was sitting there with her legs swinging, reading her program, tapping it on the bench and on her lap, and looking around to see who was upstairs and looking over the edge to see who was downstairs. She could not sit still. And finally that piece was over, and she said, oh, that Beethoven, his music is so boring. My music is so much more interesting. So he said he would never sit with her at a concert again. And along those lines, I do remember one time in a telephone conversation with her, she was talking about driving back from Brandon. And in this country, they had this little VW Bug. And she said, it was dreadful. Our trip back from Brandon was dreadful because we were driving in this little car and these other big cars were passing us so arrogantly. It was also personalized, They were so arrogant the way they were passing and spraying all this water at them in the storm. And her English, she was very brave with her English, but sometimes you had to guess at what she meant. She was talking to me, and this was after I had already left to go to graduate school and was back for something, and she said, on the telephone, she said, yes, and I think this was the word she used, your growth has been so consequent. I believe that was the word. It could have been consecutive, but I think it was consequent. And so I wrote it down for myself, and then I pondered that later, and I think what she meant was consistent, that it had developed, it had just unfolded very naturally, and it's very consequent growth. So she was delightful. She was so colorful, and at the time you're growing up and you just take your surroundings as your surroundings. You don't think that much about it. But now looking back, I think what a gift it was that she was in my life, and what a gift that Ferdinand was in my life. And that's an enriching part. I just can't imagine life without that. I still see them so vividly as alive because there was so much energy there in each one of them. It just took me a long time. I'm sure it was a full 10 years before I really realized that she was gone because she was so present. And the way they spoke so respectfully of each other is truly remarkable. Yes, I'll say this on tape because who knows, it may never be recorded any other way. I really think Ferdinand is unique in my experience, a really, truly unusual man in that here he spent his retirement years promoting the works of his wife and her first husband. I just think it takes an enormous person to be able to do that, to be free enough not to be threatened by that, and to see their work as being as great as it was so that he could really devote his energies to their promotion. I think that's extraordinary. Needs to be mentioned. So, well, I'm sure this story you have from someone else about rolling on the floor.
No, I don't think so.
Well, he told me that that sometimes, she'd compose a lot at night, and in cold, winter winters, you couldn't go outside very well. And she would just be so excited and have so much energy, pent-up energy from sheer excitement, that he said she would just lie down on the floor and roll across this small room, just to try to get rid of energy, just to roll. She didn't know what else to do. Get rid of it.
No, I hadn't heard that before.
Oh, okay.
I didn't know that story, so I don't. Yeah. It might be somewhere, but
I don't know. And of course, like many other composers, she would wake up during the night and jot things down. And of course, you have the story of how they stole a painting from an art gallery.
That's in the book.
In the book?
No, it never made it to the final edition.
Oh, it's not in Music from Within?
No, but it's in the earlier edition.
Oh, I see, because I heard Ferdinand tell that story himself.
Yes, I've read that. No, that was in, because of course, originally it was about 3 times as long.
The book?
Yeah.
In German?
No, there's an English version. Direct, but of course we've just got like one copy here, I think.
Yes.
And then the editor, in collaboration with Dr. Eckhardt, condensed it to the published form. And that story was originally in there, but ended up being thrown out.
Yeah. Well, the Music from Within is a fabulous book, and it's really wonderfully written. So fascinating. But sometime I'd like to read it. I'll just have to come here for a day.
Yeah, you have to come here for a day and read it. Yeah. It's a little bit.
It's probably awkward.
It's a little bit awkward because his English was very good, but to go on for that long in English was, I think, a little bit awkward at times for him. But it's not a matter of grammar or anything technical like that. His English was really beautiful, but it's more just the writing style is a little bit interesting at times, and it's a long read. There's a lot of it's mostly excerpts from the diaries and letters that are just printed there, almost verbatim except translated. Of course, there's also the versions of the book that are completely in German, and versions of the book where nothing's been translated. I think his original, like his writing is in German and in English, and where he's quoted letters and diaries, he's simply left it in whatever language it happened to be, so French or German or English. And I haven't actually looked at that book or the German one. I just looked at the English one.
There's one other memory I have of Eckhardt-Gramatté, and that was when Abby Simon came to Winnipeg to play at the University of Manitoba at the invitation of Leonard Isaacs. I was studying with him at the time, but I also had to do a recording session for CBC Talent Festival. So I coordinated that with his trip here, and we came together so I could hear his concert here. And at the reception afterwards, there was some kind of reception afterwards, I met Sonia in the ladies' room. And this was when Ferdinand was in the hospital and quite seriously ill, and she was just so distraught, just so distraught. And so you could tell she'd been weeping a lot, and when people asked about him, she'd start crying. But she met me in the ladies' room, and she said, "I just tested Mr. Simon. I spoke to him in French to see how good his French really is." You know? Well, he had lived in Geneva for at least 10 years, so I suppose he spoke French quite well. But she thought she would just see, you know, if he was as knowledgeable as he should be. And this story you may have from someone else too, that my father had gone to see Dr. Eckhardt, Ferdinand Eckhardt, in the hospital when he was so very ill, and said, "Well, Ferdinand, is there anything I can do for you?" He says, "Yes, keep Sonia out of here." He says, "She is so beside herself. I don't know what to do with her." I mean, she was so, because I think because Walter Gramatté had died, she didn't trust the medical establishment, and she was just so frightened that he would die. But she was just so distraught. It became a problem for Ferdinand in the hospital. So, what can I do for you? Keep her out of here.
No, I hadn't heard that one either.
Oh, is he? And I'm sure he said it kindly. And you know, I never heard him speak harshly about her, or ever heard that he did. It was probably to protect her as much as him. Well, that's all I'm remembering.
Okay. Well, I think that's plenty. That's good as much as.